Chapter 1, The Unearthed Secret. George Hall liked knowing where things were. It wasn't just about organization, though everything in his house had a place, from the neatly labeled jars in the kitchen to the carefully wound extension cords in the barn. It was about certainty, predictability, peace. You didn't get much of that in life, not really. But you could build it piece by piece if you worked at it long enough. He leaned on the handle of the sledgehammer, breath steady despite the work, and looked over the jagged section of broken concrete in his cellar floor. Dust hung faintly in the air, catching in the work light he'd set up on a folding chair. "This is what I get for deciding to improve things," he muttered to himself. The cellar had been one of the last projects. The rest of the house had come together over the years. New wiring, insulation, the creaky old windows replaced with ones that didn't rattle every time the wind picked up. The barn had become something he still occasionally stood in just to admire. Half movie theater, half clubhouse. Entirely unexpected for a man who used to think weekends meant catching up on laundry. But the cellar had waited. Now he had time. And enough money left over from years of careful saving and working overtime that he could finally turn it into what he wanted. A proper storage space, maybe even a small wine cellar. Nothing extravagant. Just finished. He nudged a loose chunk of concrete aside with his boot and crouched, picking up another piece to toss onto the growing pile. That's when he heard it. A hollow, metallic knock, different from the dull crack of concrete. George froze. He tilted his head, listening, as if the floor might say something else. When it didn't, he tapped the sledgehammer lightly against the same spot again. Clang. Ha! Carefully now, he set the hammer down and knelt, brushing away loose dust and gravel with his gloved hands. The outline came into view slowly, a straight edge where none should have been. "That's not right," he said under his breath. He worked more deliberately, clearing debris away until the object beneath became unmistakable. Metal. Rectangular. Solid. A lockbox. George sat back on his heels, staring at it. "Well," he said after a moment, "that feels like something I shouldn't touch." For a long second, he didn't move. The cellar, usually cool and still, seemed heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. He stood abruptly, brushing dust from his jeans. "Nope, not doing that." He left the cellar, climbed the stairs, and crossed into the kitchen where sunlight poured through the windows. The normalcy of it, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirping of birds, grounded him again. He washed his hands slowly at the sink, watching the gray dust spin down the drain. "You find a mysterious box buried under your house," he said aloud. "You don't open it. You call someone who gets paid to deal with bad decisions." He reached for his phone. The sheriff didn't send a deputy. He came himself. George knew something about that wasn't typical, even if he didn't know enough about police work to say exactly why. He watched from the front porch as the vehicles rolled in. First the sheriff's SUV, then 2 deputies, then another car marked state police, and finally a van that definitely didn't belong to anyone just taking a casual look around. "Well," George said softly, "that's encouraging." He stepped off the porch as Sheriff Nolan climbed out of his vehicle. A broad man with graying hair and a steady expression that fell somewhere between polite and preoccupied. "Mr. Hall?" the sheriff called. "That's me." George nodded, offering a hand. "I appreciate you coming out. I might have overreacted." Sheriff Nolan shook his hand firmly. "Let's take a look before we decide that." George led them inside, down through the kitchen and into the cellar. He stayed back as they moved forward, giving them space, answering questions when asked, but otherwise keeping quiet. It didn't take long for the room to fill with activity. Lights were repositioned, tools appeared, quiet voices exchanged observations that George couldn't quite make out. He stepped back toward the stairs. "Well, nothing I can do down here," he said to no one in particular. Upstairs, he moved automatically, filling the kettle, pulling mugs from the cabinet. It was something to do, something normal. When the sheriff came back up a few minutes later, George was lining up cups on the counter. "Coffee?" George offered. Sheriff Nolan gave a brief nod. "I won't say no to that." George poured carefully, sliding a mug across. "I take it this wasn't a waste of your time." The sheriff held the cup but didn't drink yet. "You did the right thing calling it in." "That sounds like the kind of answer that means I really did the right thing," George replied. A faint smile appeared, just for a moment. "It might help us with something that's been unresolved for a while." George leaned back against the counter, arms folding loosely. "You're not going to tell me what that means, are you?" "Not yet." Figured. They stood in a brief, comfortable quiet. Then George gestured vaguely toward the rest of the house. "You want to look around? Make sure nothing else is hiding where it shouldn't be." The sheriff studied him for a second. "You're offering?" "Yeah," George said simply. "I don't have anything to hide. And if there's more, I'd rather know now than later." Another pause. Then the sheriff nodded, reaching for his radio. George turned back to the counter, picking up his own coffee. As the low murmur of instructions filled the house, he walked to the front window and looked out over the property. The gravel road stretched quiet and empty. The barn stood solid in the distance, painted fresh, sunlight stretching along its side. Everything exactly where it should be. For the first time in years, George had the distinct feeling that might not be true for long. Behind him, the front door opened again. "Sheriff wants us to take a look around," a new voice said. Steady, clear, and unfamiliar. George turned. The deputy standing there met his gaze without hesitation. She was maybe mid-30s, posture straight, expression composed, but there was something sharp in her eyes, something observant that missed very little. "I'm Deputy Claire Maddox," she said. George nodded once. "George Hall." She glanced past him briefly, taking in the room before returning her attention to him. "You're the one who found the box." "Unfortunately, yes." One corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "People usually say, fortunately. Not when it involves buried surprises in your own house." That earned a soft huff of amusement. "Fair point." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "Mind if I take a look around?" George gestured toward the hallway. "Be my guest." As she moved past him, he found himself watching her for a second longer than necessary before turning back to the window. "Yep," he muttered quietly to himself. "Definitely not my normal kind of day." And somehow, he had the feeling it wasn't going to get simpler from here. Chapter 2, Terms of Curiosity. George Hall had always believed that trouble announced itself loudly. In his experience, it arrived with raised voices, slammed doors, or arguments that stretched late into the night until everyone was too tired to continue but too stubborn to stop. Trouble had a sound, a shape, a momentum that built until it couldn't be ignored. What he was not used to was trouble that lingered quietly. The next morning, his house felt exactly the same. The sunlight fell across the kitchen table in the same easy angles. The old floor creaked in the same familiar places. The coffee maker hummed with steady predictability. And yet, there was something under it all now. A shift, subtle but undeniable, like a note slightly out of tune. George poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, staring out toward the barn. "They're not going to just forget about that box," he murmured. As if to answer him, his phone buzzed against the counter. He let out a slow breath before picking it up, already knowing it wouldn't be a telemarketer. "Hall," he said. "Deputy Maddox," the voice on the other end replied, clear and composed. "I hope I'm not calling too early." George glanced at the clock. "Depends. Are you bringing more buried surprises with you? I can arrange that if you want to keep things interesting." He huffed out a small laugh before he could stop himself. "I'll pass. What can I do for you, Deputy?" "Claire is fine," she said, then paused just long enough to make it feel intentional. "I had a few follow-up questions. Thought it might be easier to come by rather than do it over the phone." George took a sip of coffee, giving himself a second to consider. He didn't have to say yes. He could ask her to schedule something later, keep things formal, controlled. "Sure," he said anyway. "I'm here all morning." "I was hoping you'd say that." Something in her tone, lighter than it had been the day before, lingered with him even after the call ended. He set the phone down and stared at it for a moment. "Well," he said to the empty kitchen. That was quicker than expected. Claire Maddox did not knock timidly. George noticed that immediately. The knock was firm, deliberate, like someone who assumed they would be answered, and expected it promptly. He opened the door before she reached a third knock. "Morning," she said, lowering her hand. "Morning," he returned. "You always this efficient? Or am I getting special treatment?" She stepped inside, her gaze already moving, taking in the room with that same quiet attentiveness he remembered from yesterday. "You're getting the full experience. Questions, observations, and possibly judgment about your coffee." "That sounds dangerous," George said, closing the door behind her. "Come on in." She followed him into the kitchen, setting a small notebook on the table but not opening it yet. "Smells decent," she said, glancing toward the coffee maker. "High praise. I save my compliments for things that impress me." George poured her a cup and slid it across the table. "Guess I'll aim higher next time." Her mouth curved faintly as she took the mug. "We'll see." They sat across from each other, a moment settling between them. Not uncomfortable, but aware. Claire broke it first. "When you bought the house, did anything stand out to you about the cellar?" George shook his head. "Not really. It was old, a little uneven in places. I knew I'd have to redo parts of it eventually." He took another sip of coffee. "The section I broke up. Honestly, I just thought it was a bad patch job." "Did the previous owner mention any repairs or oddities?" "No." George leaned back slightly. "They were older. Downsizing. Gave me a list of things they knew needed fixing, most of which I've already dealt with." He paused. "Nothing about hidden boxes, if that's what you're hoping for." Claire nodded slowly, absorbing it. It wouldn't usually come up in casual conversation. "No," he agreed. "I suppose not." She leaned forward slightly, resting her forearm on the table. "You said yesterday you'd been here a few years. You've done a lot of work on the property since then." "Yeah," George said. "Keeps me out of trouble." Her gaze flicked up to meet his. "And have you found anything else?" she asked. "Define anything," he replied. "Unusual," she said. "Out of place. Something that made you stop and think twice." George considered it, then shook his head again. "Nothing like that. Just normal old house issues." wiring that needed replacing, insulation that might as well not have existed. He hesitated. Why? You think there's more? Claire didn't answer right away. I think, she said finally, that whatever that box is connected to, it wasn't accidental. George set his cup down. That doesn't sound reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. He studied her for a moment, then sighed quietly. Great. So I've been living on top of a mystery for years. Seems like it. Well, he said dryly. At least it waited until I finished the expensive renovations. She let out a quick laugh, surprising herself more than him. Timing is considerate like that sometimes. Yeah, George said, watching her. Sometimes. There it was again, that ease, slipping into the conversation without effort. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Claire seemed to notice the shift too, because she straightened slightly, her tone returning to something more official. I'd like to take another look at the cellar, she said. And possibly the barn. The barn? George raised an eyebrow. You think I've got secrets hidden in my movie theater now? People hide things in the spaces they use the least, she said. Or the ones they think no one will question. George considered that, then nodded. Fair enough. He stood, gesturing toward the hallway. After you. As they walked toward the cellar door, Claire glanced around again. Slower this time. You've made this place your own, she said. George shrugged. Took a while. It shows. There was no exaggeration in her voice. No politeness either. Just a simple observation. He found himself oddly pleased by it. Kids helped, he said, opening the cellar door. They took over the second floor the minute they decided they liked it here. Claire paused at the top of the stairs. How old? 14 and 13, he said. Shelley and Bella. Her expression softened slightly. That's a good age. Debatable, George replied. Depends on the day. That's fair. They descended into the cellar, the air cooler, the faint scent of dust and concrete still lingering from yesterday's work. The broken section of floor remained untouched, now marked with small flags and evidence tags. Claire moved toward it immediately, crouching near the exposed area but not touching anything. State's coming back later, she said. They'll continue processing. George leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely. You say that like I should be getting used to company. Possibly. He shook his head, a faint smile pulling at his mouth. I moved out here for peace and quiet. And how's that working out for you? He glanced toward the broken floor, then back at her. Ask me again in a week, he said. Claire looked up at him, meeting his gaze with something that wasn't quite amusement, but close. I will, she said. The simplicity of it hung there for a second longer than it should have. George cleared his throat. Barn's this way, he said, pushing off from the wall. As they made their way back upstairs, he caught himself thinking something he hadn't expected. The investigation might complicate things. It might drag up details he'd rather leave buried. It might disrupt the careful, steady life he'd built. But for reasons he wasn't entirely ready to examine, it didn't feel like something he wanted to avoid. Chapter 3 Movie nights and mixed signals. George Hall liked routines almost as much as he liked knowing where things were. Friday nights had become one of those routines. Not rigid, not scheduled down to the minute, but dependable in a way that mattered. The girls would arrive around 6, their voices carrying ahead of them from the driveway, bags slung over their shoulders even though they never stayed overnight without forgetting at least one essential thing. By 7, the barn would be lit, the projector humming, and the smell of popcorn drifting through the open doors. It was simple, predictable, safe, which was exactly why George found himself standing in the kitchen that afternoon, staring at his phone like it had personally offended him. He hadn't meant to invite her. That was the frustrating part. The call had been practical, Claire asking if she could stop by again, a brief update about the investigation, something about the state team returning next week. They'd talked longer than necessary, drifting into easier conversation without quite acknowledging it. And then, so, what do you do with the place when you're not uncovering mysteries? She'd asked. Depends, George had said, leaning against the counter. Kids are here this weekend. We usually do a movie night in the barn. There had been a pause. Not long, just enough. That sounds surprisingly fun, she'd said. It is, he replied, then added without stopping himself. You're welcome to stop by if you want to see it. Silence, followed by a quiet, I might take you up on that. George exhaled slowly now, setting the phone down. Well, he muttered. That was unnecessary. The back door swung open before he could think any further. Dad! Bella's voice came first, bright and immediate, followed closely by Shelley's more measured but equally enthusiastic. We're here. George turned, the tension slipping away without effort. In the kitchen, he called. Bella appeared first, already mid-sentence about something that sounded like a disagreement at school. Shelley followed, rolling her eyes but smiling anyway. You would not believe, Bella started. How dramatic she's being. Shelley cut in. I am not dramatic. You absolutely are. George held up a hand. All right, pause. One at a time or neither of you get snacks. They stopped instantly. Shelley gestured. She can go first. Bella beamed triumphantly. George shook his head, hiding a smile as he leaned back against the counter, listening as Bella launched into her story with full energy. Shelley added corrections where she felt necessary, which Bella protested, which led to a second version of the same story that was somehow longer and louder. It was chaotic, but it was his kind of chaos. Somewhere in the middle of it, Shelley paused, narrowing her eyes at him slightly. "Why are you smiling like that?" George blinked. "Like what?" "Like you're thinking about something," she said, "and not telling us." Bella turned immediately. "Are we getting a dog?" "No." "Then what is it?" "Nothing," he said a little too quickly. Shelley crossed her arms. "That was suspicious. I invited someone to movie night," he admitted before he could overthink it. There was a beat of silence. Bella lit up. "Who?" "A friend," George said carefully. Shelley raised an eyebrow. "You don't have friends." "I do." "Name 3. George opened his mouth, then closed it again. "That's not the point." "That is absolutely the point," Shelley said. Bella leaned forward, excited. "Is it a woman friend?" George exhaled. "Yes." They both stared at him. Then, at the exact same moment, "Oh my God," Shelley said. "Oh my God," Bella echoed louder. "It's not a thing," George said quickly. She's involved in something with the house." "That sounds fake," Shelley replied. "It's not fake," Bella gasped. "Is she the police lady?" George paused. "That depends on which police lady you're referring to," he said cautiously. "There's only one," Bella said. "The one who smiled at you weird." Shelley nodded. "Yeah, that one." George dragged a hand over his face. "She did not smile at me weird." "She did," both girls said. "She was being polite," he insisted. "That was not polite," Shelley said. "That was interested." George opened his mouth to argue, and realized he didn't actually have a solid counterargument. "She's coming tonight," he said instead. Bella clapped her hands. "This is the best movie night ever." "It's a normal movie night," George corrected. Shelley smirked. "Not anymore." By the time evening settled in, the sky softening into that golden blur that came just before sunset, George found himself adjusting things in the barn that didn't need adjusting. The projector was already aligned. The sound system had been tested twice. The mini fridge was stocked. The popcorn machine sat ready. And yet, "You're pacing," Shelley observed from the doorway. "I'm not pacing," George replied, setting a stack of cups down that had already been stacked properly. "You walked back and forth 3 times. I'm making sure everything's ready." "It's always ready," Bella added, appearing beside her sister. George pointed at them. "You two are remarkably unhelpful." Shelley shrugged. "We're observant." Bella grinned. "And invested." "In what?" "Your love life." "I don't have a love life." "That's why we're invested," Shelley said. George sighed, leaning against the pool table. "She's just coming to watch a movie." "Sure," Shelley said, clearly unconvinced. Before George could respond, the distant sound of tires on gravel drifted toward them. All 3 of them went still. Bella broke first. "She's here." "No one panic," George said. "You seem panicked," Shelley replied. "I'm not panicked. You rearranged the popcorn machine twice. That was necessary." "It wasn't." George straightened, exhaling slowly. "All right, everyone just act normal." Bella nodded solemnly. "We are incapable of that." The truck came to a stop outside. A moment later, Claire appeared in the barn doorway, framed by the fading light behind her. For a second, everything felt quieter. She wore jeans and a simple jacket, nothing official, nothing that marked her as part of the investigation. Just her. "Hi," she said, taking in the space with a quick glance. "I hope this isn't a bad time." "No," George said quickly. "Not at all." Bella stepped forward immediately. "Hi, I'm Bella." Claire's expression brightened slightly as she crouched to meet her at eye level. "Claire." Shelley followed, a little more reserved but equally curious. "Shelley." "Nice to meet you," Claire said, then glanced back at George. "You didn't mention I'd be getting a full introduction committee." "I didn't realize I had one," George replied. "You definitely do," Shelley said. Claire stood, her gaze moving around the barn again, slower this time. "This is." She paused, searching for the right word. "Not what I expected." George crossed his arms lightly. "Good or bad?" "Definitely good," she said. "You turned this into something really special." The sincerity in her voice landed differently than he expected. "Thanks," he said, a little quieter. Bella grabbed Claire's wrist, lightly but with purpose. "Come on. We'll show you everything." "Bella," George started. "It's fine," Claire said, already being pulled along. "I don't mind." Shelley followed, narrating as they went, pointing out details George hadn't thought about in years. The arrangement of chairs, the way the sound echoed just right, the corner where they kept extra blankets. George stayed where he was for a moment, watching. They fit together easily. Too easily. Claire laughed at something Bella said, the sound carrying warm and unforced across the room. Shelley added something quick and clever, earning a grin in return. It looked unnatural. George exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered under his breath. That's new. A few minutes later, Claire wandered back toward him while the girls debated movie options with unnecessary intensity. They're great, she said quietly. They are, George agreed. You've done a good job with them. He glanced at her, surprised by the straightforwardness of it. Thanks. She leaned lightly against the edge of the pool table, not quite facing him, not quite turned away. For someone who avoids chaos, she said, you've built something that has a lot of life in it. George let out a small breath, half a laugh. This isn't chaos. This is contained. Claire smiled faintly. I think you might be underestimating it. Or managing it, he countered. Maybe both. They stood there for a moment, the hum of conversation from the girls filling the space between them. Then Bella called out, We picked the movie. Shelley added, And you don't get a say, Dad. George pushed off the table. I never do. Claire glanced at him, her expression light but thoughtful. Good, she said. Then I picked a good night to show up. George met her gaze, something steady settling beneath the earlier uncertainty. Yeah, he said. You did. And for once, the shift in his carefully ordered life didn't feel like something he needed to fix. It felt like something he might actually want to keep. Chapter 4, Close to the Past. By Sunday afternoon, the house felt fuller than usual. Not louder, George was careful about that, but fuller in a way that lingered even after the girls had gone upstairs and the barn had gone quiet again. The remnants of movie night still dotted the edges of things. A forgotten blanket draped over a chair. An empty soda can left with good intentions but poor follow-through. The faint, buttery scent of popcorn that had settled into the wood like it belonged there. George stood at the sink, rinsing out cups that didn't really need rinsing again. She's coming back, you know, Bella said from behind him. He didn't turn. Who is? Claire, she replied immediately. Shelley's voice followed from the table. You don't need to pretend. It's obvious. George dried his hands slowly, buying time. She's part of the investigation, he said, turning around. She might come back for that. Bella tilted her head. That's not what I meant. I know, he said a little too quickly. Shelley leaned back in her chair, studying him like she had developed a professional interest in his behavior. You didn't look annoyed when she stayed, she said. I wasn't annoyed. You're usually annoyed when people stay longer than planned. That's not true. It is, both girls said in perfect unison. George pressed his lips together, resisting the urge to argue a losing battle. She gets along with you, Bella added softer now. And with us. That doesn't automatically mean anything, George replied. No, Shelley said. But it's a start. George pointed at them both. You two are reading way too much into this. Bella grinned. You're not reading enough. He exhaled, turning back to the sink even though there was nothing left to do there. This is not a discussion, he said. It absolutely is, Shelley countered. It's over, George said firmly. There was a pause. Okay, Bella said brightly. We'll just wait. George frowned. Wait for what? Shelley smiled, slow and knowing. You to figure it out. It was quieter after they left, not empty. George had long since grown used to the shifting rhythm of his life, the ebb and flow between full and quiet, but the contrast still landed. He walked through the house in the late afternoon, straightening things that didn't need straightening, checking locks that were already secure. Routine. Predictable. Safe. He made it halfway down the stairs toward the cellar before stopping, one hand resting against the wall. Right, he muttered. That's still a thing. The broken section of floor remained undisturbed, marked and carefully avoided. The state team had come through earlier in the day, methodical and efficient, saying little more than necessary. They had removed the lockbox, along with several smaller items George hadn't even known were there. He stepped down into the cooler air, glancing at the space where the box had been. Felt different now. Not dangerous, but not neutral anymore either. Funny how that works, he said quietly. You get used to things, a voice behind him replied. George turned, startled despite himself. Claire stood at the top of the stairs, one hand resting lightly on the railing. I knocked, she added, almost apologetically. I didn't hear it, he said. Come on down. She descended slowly, her gaze settling on the marked-out section of floor. They finished collecting everything for now, she said. So I noticed. George crossed his arms loosely. Am I supposed to feel better about that? Depends, she replied. Do you? He considered it for a second. Not worse, he admitted. That's something. They stood in the quiet for a moment, both looking at the same empty stretch of concrete. Claire crouched slightly, not crossing any of the marked boundaries, but close enough to study the area. It wasn't just the box, she said after a moment. George frowned. No, there were remnants underneath. Fabric. Some paper. She straightened. Old, but preserved enough to matter. George let out a slow breath. And you still can't tell me what it is? Not yet. He nodded, accepting it more easily this time. All right. Claire glanced around the cellar, her attention drifting beyond the marked space now. You've done a lot down here, she said. Trying to, he replied. It was rough when I got it. You do most of the work yourself? Yeah. He shrugged. Helps me think. She gave him a look that was sharper than casual curiosity. About what? George hesitated, then huffed out a small breath. About whatever's easier to deal with if I keep my hands busy. Claire studied him for a second longer, then nodded like that answer made perfect sense. Fair, she said. He shifted his weight. What about you? He asked. You always think this much about other people's cellars? Or am I still getting special treatment? That depends, she said lightly. Do you always offer coffee and open access to your house? Only when I'm trying to avoid making bad decisions. Claire tilted her head, considering him. And how's that working out? George met her gaze. Ask me in a week. She smiled. Not broadly, not dramatically, but enough to soften the seriousness that seemed to follow her everywhere else. Still planning to keep me around that long? She asked. The question hung between them for half a second too long to be entirely casual. George pushed off from the wall, gesturing toward the stairs. Come on, he said. There's something in the barn I want to show you. Is it another buried secret? She asked as she followed him up. No, he said. Something I actually meant to be there. The late afternoon light had shifted by the time they stepped into the barn, stretching long across the open space. The chairs were still slightly out of place from the night before, the projector screen blank but expectant. Claire slowed as she stepped inside, looking around again, but this time more thoughtfully. It's different in the daytime, she said. Yeah, George replied. Less distractions. She walked toward the far wall, running her gaze over the setup. You built all this so your kids would want to be here, she said quietly. George leaned against one of the support beams. That was the idea. And it worked. He nodded. Most days, yeah. Claire turned slightly, her expression softer than it had been downstairs. That takes more than just building something, she said. It takes showing up. George looked at her, something in the phrasing catching his attention. I had a lot of time to figure out what mattered, he said. After everything. The divorce? She asked, not prying, just acknowledging. Yeah. She didn't ask for details, which George realized he appreciated more than if she had. He pushed off the beam, walking toward the small bar setup and flipping open the mini fridge. You want something? He asked. She nodded. Water's fine. He handed her a bottle, grabbing one for himself. They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the barn settling around them in a way that felt different than the cellar. Easier. Claire took a sip, then leaned lightly against the edge of the bar. You know, she said. Most people wouldn't have called that in. George glanced at her. The box. Yeah. He shrugged. Most people aren't interested in finding out what happens if they make the wrong decision. Or they are, she said. And they don't think about the consequences first. George smiled faintly. I've done enough of that already. Claire watched him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Does it get easier? She asked. He blinked. What? Choosing the safe option, she clarified. Avoiding the chaos. George considered it longer this time. It gets familiar, he said finally. You learn how to recognize the patterns. You stay away from things that feel like they might spiral. And does it make you happy? The question landed heavier than she probably intended. George looked down at the bottle in his hand, then back out across the barn. It makes things steady, he said. Claire didn't respond right away. When he looked back at her, she was still watching him, but not critically, just thoughtfully. Steady's good, she said. Yeah. Another brief silence passed. Then she pushed off from the bar, setting the empty bottle down. Well, she said, her tone shifting back to something lighter. I should let you get back to your very steady life. George nodded, though he didn't move immediately. You're heading out? For now. He walked with her toward the door, the fading light outside casting long shadows across the gravel. Claire paused near her car, turning back toward him. I meant what I said, she added. About what you've built here. George gave a small nod. I know. She hesitated just briefly. Then, I'll be back when we have more, she said. George met her gaze, steady. Yeah, he replied. I figured. She opened her door, then paused again, glancing back once more. And George, she said. Yeah. Try not to dig up anything else while I'm gone. He smirked faintly. No promises. That earned a quiet laugh before she slipped into the car and pulled away, the sound of tires on gravel fading slowly into the distance. George stood there for a moment longer than necessary, hands in his pockets, watching the road long after it was empty. Then he exhaled, turning back toward the barn. Steady, he muttered, but for the first time in years, the word didn't feel quite as certain as it used to. Chapter 5. Unwelcome echoes. Trouble, George reflected, did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it showed up in a car he recognized before it even turned into the driveway. He was halfway through sanding down a section of wood along the barn doorway when he heard the slow crunch of tires on gravel. He didn't bother looking up at first. Visitors had become more frequent lately, and he had learned not to react to every passing vehicle like it was a problem. Then the engine cut off, and the quiet that followed felt familiar. George straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag before turning toward the driveway. Well, he murmured to himself, that figures. Tina didn't step out right away. She sat in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, staring ahead as if she were deciding something. It was a posture George remembered all too well, hesitation wrapped around determination, as though she had already chosen her next move but wanted to make it seem like she hadn't. He walked toward her, not rushing, not delaying. When she finally opened the door, she smiled. It was a practiced smile, controlled, confident, the kind that used to mean something very different when they were younger. George, she said. Tina. They stood there for a moment, the distance between them measured not just in steps but in years. You look, she began, her eyes moving over him, taking in the worn jeans, the rolled-up sleeves, the dust from the barn clinging to him in patches. Settled. George gave a faint shrug. That's one word for it. She smiled again, slightly sharper this time. I heard about what you found. Of course you did. It's all over town, she said lightly. You've been keeping things interesting out here. That wasn't the goal. No, she said, glancing toward the house and then the barn, taking everything in as if seeing it for the first time. I imagine not. George crossed his arms, not defensively, but comfortably. It was a posture that belonged to him now. What brings you out here? He asked. Tina tilted her head slightly, like the answer should have been obvious. Our daughters are staying here this weekend. They were, George corrected. They left yesterday. A flicker of something crossed her expression. Annoyance, maybe, or mild disappointment. I thought they might still be here. They had plans. With friends? She asked. With their lives, George said evenly. Another pause. Tina shifted her weight, glancing again at the property, at the barn, at the house. You've done a lot with this place, she said. I have. And it's just yours? She added, the question drifting a little too casually into deeper territory. George met her gaze without hesitation. Yes, she nodded slowly, absorbing that. Good, she said finally. That's good for you. The words sounded right. The tone didn't quite match. You didn't come all the way out here to compliment my renovation work, George said. No, Tina admitted, exhaling softly. I didn't. She walked a few steps past him, toward the barn, running her fingers lightly along the freshly sanded wood as she passed. I've been hearing things, she said, about the box, and the investigators, and the state police. She turned back to him, her expression sharper now. People are saying it might turn into something bigger. George stayed where he was. People say a lot of things. You're not curious? I'm already involved, he said. Curiosity isn't really optional at this point. Tina studied him, like she was trying to find something that used to be familiar, but wasn't quite there anymore. You always did have a way of avoiding things, she said. George let out a quiet breath. No, he said calmly. I stopped avoiding things. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Did you? Yes. The simplicity of the answer seemed to throw her off more than an argument would have. She crossed her arms now, mirroring him without realizing it. So what? You just don't care what this turns into? I care, George said. I just don't assume it's going to be something I can control. That's not how you used to be. That's because I used to think control was the same thing as responsibility. Tina hesitated. That's not fair, she said. George tilted his head slightly. Which part? The question hung there, simple and direct, leaving her to decide what she wanted to defend. Instead, she changed direction. You've been spending time with someone, she said. George exhaled slowly, almost amused. That didn't take long. So it's true. Depends what you think is true. She's with the sheriff's department, Tina said. Claire. That's her name, right? George didn't confirm it, which was confirmation enough. Tina's mouth tightened slightly. I didn't expect you to move on like that. I didn't move on like anything, George replied. I've just been living my life. With a police officer. With someone who's part of something happening on my property, he said evenly. That's all it is. And you just invited her into your life like that? George almost smiled. There's no like that, Tina. Sometimes people just show up. She stared at him for a long second. That's not very careful, she said. He let the words settle. Careful isn't the same as closed, he said quietly. That landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but it shifted something between them in a way he recognized. Tina looked away first. I just want what's best for the girls, she said. I know. And that means stability. They have that, George replied. With me too, she added quickly, as if the thought had come in sideways. George nodded. Yes, with you too. Another silence stretched between them, thinner now, less guarded but not entirely comfortable. Tina glanced back toward her car. I didn't come here to argue, she said. I didn't assume you did. She paused, searching for something that didn't sound like what it was. I thought I should see things for myself. George looked around the property. The house, the barn, the open stretch of land that had taken him years to shape into something steady. Well, he said finally. Now you have. Tina nodded slowly. Yes, she said. I have. She walked back toward her car, stopping with her hand on the door. He's different, she said without looking at him. George frowned slightly. Who? You, she replied. Then she got in the car and closed the door. The engine started, the car turned, and just like that, she was gone, her presence folding back into the quiet she had interrupted. George stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle on the road. Yeah, he said softly. I am. Behind him, another car approached. He didn't tense this time. When it came to a stop, he already knew who it would be. Claire stepped out, glancing toward the empty road before looking back at him. Everything okay? She asked. George nodded once. Yeah, he said. She studied his face for a second longer, like she was deciding whether to believe him. That didn't feel like a casual visit, she said. It wasn't. Do you want to talk about it? George hesitated. Then he exhaled, the tension he hadn't fully acknowledged slipping just a little. My ex-wife, he said simply. Claire nodded like that explained enough. Those are rarely casual, she said. No, George replied. They're not. She stepped closer, not intruding, just present. You okay? She asked again, quieter this time. George met her gaze, and for the first time that day the answer felt steady again. Yeah, he said. I am. Claire gave a small nod, accepting it without pushing further. Good, she said. Pause followed, not awkward, not heavy, just open. Then George glanced toward the barn. You come out here for the investigation, he said. Or something else? Claire's mouth curved slightly. Both, she admitted. He nodded once, something lighter settling back into place. All right, he said. Then let's see what we've got. Chapter 6, The Evening That Changed Things. The farmhouse had a way of settling into quiet at dusk that George had come to rely on. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the sense that everything had found its place for the day. The tools were put away. The dust had settled. The light softened just enough to take the edge off sharp corners and long thoughts alike. He stood in the cellar again, hands braced against his hips, staring down at the half-finished work like it might explain itself if he looked at it long enough. Didn't. You keep coming back down here like it's going to suddenly make sense. Claire's voice drifted from the top of the stairs. George didn't turn right away. It might. It won't. Optimism looks good on you, he said, finally glancing over his shoulder. Claire descended slowly, a small toolbox in her hand this time. What's that? He asked. An excuse to stand here and not be entirely useless, she replied, setting it down on the edge of an old crate. Also, I figured if you're going to keep breaking things, someone should supervise. I've been doing fine on my own. I'm sure you have, she said, not unkindly. But I've seen your definition of fine. It involves a lot of guesswork and a stubborn refusal to ask for help. George huffed a laugh. That sounds suspiciously specific. She shrugged, crouching near the edge of the cleared section. It's a professional observation. Of me. Of people like you. He folded his arms loosely. And what exactly does that mean? Claire looked up at him, one eyebrow lifting just slightly. People who carry everything themselves because they've convinced themselves it's easier that way. George opened his mouth to argue, and then didn't. Instead, he picked up a loose piece of debris and set it aside, buying himself a moment. Still sounds like a generalization, he said finally. Maybe, she replied. But you didn't deny it. He met her gaze, holding it for a second longer than necessary. No, he admitted. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at being right. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Hand me that, she said, nodding toward a small pry bar resting nearby. George stepped closer, passing it to her. Careful, he said automatically. That section's uneven. I noticed, she replied, shifting her weight with easy balance. He watched her work for a moment, the precision in her movements, the way she examined each edge before applying pressure, measured and controlled. You've done this before, he said. Not exactly this, she answered, but enough things that are close. That sounds vague on purpose. It is, she said, glancing up with a faint smile. George shook his head, a small breath of amusement escaping him. You're not going to tell me, are you? Nope. All right, he said, leaning against the wall. I'll just assume it involves you being right more often than not. That's a safe assumption. They worked in companionable silence for a while after that. It was different from the quiet he was used to, not empty, not solitary, just shared. At some point, George realized he wasn't thinking about the work anymore. He was thinking about how easily she fit into the space. How long have you been doing this? He asked suddenly. Claire didn't look up. Doing what? This, he said. The job. The investigating. Showing up in places like this and asking questions people don't want to answer. She paused, setting the tool down before straightening. Long enough to know that most people don't actually mind answering, she said. They just mind what the answers might mean. George nodded slowly. That tracks. She brushed her hands off, stepping back from the edge of the worksite. What about you? She asked. What about me? How long did it take you to get here? She clarified, gesturing vaguely upward. To the house, the barn, everything beyond the cellar walls. George rubbed the back of his neck, considering. A few years, he said. Some parts longer than others. And the rest? He let out a quiet breath. The rest I'm still figuring out. Claire tilted her head slightly. That's an honest answer. I try not to lie when it's unnecessary. Good policy. Learned it the hard way, he added. She didn't ask what that meant. Instead, she leaned back against one of the support beams, crossing her arms. I used to think movement meant progress, she said after a moment. New places, new assignments, not staying long enough for anything to get complicated. George watched her, saying nothing. It works for a while, she continued. Keeps things clean. Simple. And now? He asked. Claire's gaze drifted toward the unfinished floor. Now I'm not so sure simple was ever the same as better. The words settled between them, quiet but weighty. George pushed off the wall, stepping closer. Not too close, just enough to shift the space between them. Complicated's overrated, he said. Claire smiled faintly. That's exactly what someone who's had too much of it would say. He almost laughed. Fair, he admitted. A silence followed, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just aware. George reached for the water bottle he'd left on a nearby ledge, unscrewing the cap before holding it out. Claire took it without hesitation, their fingers brushing briefly. Neither of them reacted outwardly, but something shifted anyway. You ever get tired of it? She asked, taking a sip before handing the bottle back. Of what? Being the steady one. George turned the bottle in his hands, the plastic creaking softly under his grip. Sometimes, he said. And then, he met her gaze again. Then I remember why it matters. Claire studied him for a moment, something softer settling into her expression. Your kids, she said. Yeah. She nodded slowly. They're lucky. George gave a small shake of his head. No, I am. The simplicity of that answer seemed to catch her off guard. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, Claire said, You don't give yourself much credit, do you? George shrugged. I don't need to. You probably do, she replied. He smiled faintly. And you probably give too much of yourself to things that don't ask nicely. Claire huffed out a soft laugh. That feels uncomfortably accurate. Professional observation, he said. Of me. Of people like you. She held his gaze, the corner of her mouth lifting. Guess we're even, then. Looks that way. The moment stretched, not awkward, not rushed. Just open. George felt it then, clear and undeniable. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't disruption. It was something else entirely. Something he hadn't planned for, hadn't prepared for, but couldn't quite bring himself to step away from. Claire pushed off the beam, glancing toward the stairs. I should probably go, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Probably, George agreed. Neither of them moved right away. Then she let out a quiet breath, picking up her toolbox. Try not to tear up the rest of the floor while I'm gone, she said. I'll do my best, he replied. She started up the stairs, then paused halfway, looking back down at him. George. Yeah. Simple doesn't have to mean alone. The words landed softly, but they didn't fade. He nodded once. I know. Claire held his gaze for a second longer, then continued up the stairs and out into the fading light. George stayed where he was. The cellar felt different now, not less uncertain, but less contained. He looked down at the unfinished floor, then toward the stairs she just climbed. Yeah, he murmured to himself. Definitely not simple anymore. Chapter 7, What Was Buried. The call came earlier than George expected. He was halfway through replacing a section of shelving in the cellar, carefully avoiding the area still marked by the investigation, when his phone buzzed against the wooden ledge. He glanced at it, saw Claire's name, and didn't hesitate before answering. Hey, he said. We have an update, she replied. Her voice was steady, but there was something under it, something quieter, less official. George leaned the plank he was holding against the wall. That sounds like it's either very good or very complicated. A brief pause. Probably both, she said. Can you come up to the house? I'm already there. Yeah, he said. Give me a minute. When he stepped into the kitchen, Claire was standing near the table, a folder resting in her hands. She wasn't pacing, but she wasn't entirely still either, shifting her weight slightly, as if she had more energy than she knew what to do with. Coffee? George asked automatically. She glanced at him, then gave a faint smile. Always. He poured without asking how she took it anymore. That detail had settled itself somewhere along the way. So, he said, handing her the mug. What did you find? Claire didn't open the folder right away. Instead, she looked at him, measuring. It's not what we thought, she said. George leaned back against the counter. That's reassuring? It depends on what you thought. He shrugged. Something buried under a cellar floor with a lockbox involved usually leans toward, don't ask too many questions. Claire exhaled softly. Yeah, that's fair. She set the folder down on the table and opened it, turning it slightly so he could see. There was no indication of violence, she said. No evidence of a crime in the way we suspected. George stepped closer, looking down at the photos and documents, though most of it didn't mean much to him at first glance. Then what was it? He asked. Claire tapped one of the pages lightly. Records, she said. Financial documents, letters, property agreements. George frowned slightly. That doesn't sound like something you hide under concrete. No, she agreed. Not unless you're trying to keep it from being found. He crossed his arms. And that's not a crime? It can be, she said. But not always. In this case, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It looks like it was meant to disappear quietly. George looked at her. You're going to have to unpack that. Claire nodded, closing the folder partway as if to simplify things. The property used to belong to a family that had complications, she said. Disputes over ownership. Money tied up in ways that weren't entirely transparent, but not illegal enough to trigger an official investigation at the time. And the box contained documents that would have made those disputes a lot less ambiguous, Claire said. It seems like someone chose to remove them from the equation altogether. George let out a slow breath. So they buried it. Yeah. Why keep it at all? He asked. Why not destroy it? Claire's mouth curved faintly. Same reason people keep anything they're not supposed to. Just in case. George nodded slowly, staring down at the partially visible pages in the folder. And the letters? He asked. You mentioned those before. Claire flipped to another section, revealing scans of aged paper, handwriting faded but legible. They're personal, she said, between members of the family. Arguments, mostly, regret, attempts to fix things that were already past that point. George studied the looping script, trying to make sense of words that carried meaning for people he would never know. It wasn't about hiding something dangerous, he said quietly. No, Claire replied. It was about avoiding consequences, avoiding conflict, trying to control how things ended. George let out a quiet breath, looking away from the table. That sounds familiar, he murmured. Claire didn't respond right away. Instead, she closed the folder completely and leaned against the edge of the table. It changes things, she said. How? George asked. There's no ongoing investigation, she explained. No charges, no case to build. The documents will go through proper channels now. But for you, she gestured vaguely around them. This is just your house again. George nodded slowly, absorbing that. Just my house, he repeated. He expected that to feel like relief. Instead, it felt heavier than he anticipated. Claire watched him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. You expected it to mean more, she said. George shook his head. I didn't know what to expect. He paused, then added, but I didn't expect it to feel like this. Like what? He hesitated, searching for the right word. Like something that mattered. Didn't, he said finally. Claire considered that. I don't think it didn't matter, she said. I think it just wasn't what you thought it was. George huffed out a small breath. That's not much of a difference. It is, she said quietly. Because it still tells a story. He looked at her. Just not the one you were bracing for. That settled something in him, though he didn't say it out loud. Instead, he walked over to the window, looking out at the property, the barn, the open stretch of land, the life he had built piece by piece. People hide things when they don't want to deal with them, he said after a moment. Yeah, Claire agreed. And then someone else finds them later, he added, and has to figure out what to do with what's left. Claire stepped closer, not right beside him, but near enough that the distance didn't feel intentional. That sounds like a broader observation, she said. George smiled faintly. Maybe. A quiet stretched between them, not empty, but thoughtful. Then Claire spoke again. So, she said, what are you going to do with it? With what? The cellar, she clarified. The space, the floor, everything that comes next. George glanced back toward the door leading downstairs. Finish it, he said. Like I planned. Just like that. He shrugged. I don't see a reason not to. Claire studied him, her expression thoughtful. That's a choice, she said. It is. And what about everything else? She asked, her tone quieter now. George turned back to her fully. Everything else? He repeated. Claire met his gaze without hesitation. The part where things stopped being simple, she said. There it was. Not hidden. Not deflected. Clear. George let out a slow breath, running a hand along the back of his neck. I spent a long time making things predictable, he said. Steady. Controlled. And now. He paused, glancing briefly toward the barn before returning his attention to her. Now I'm realizing that steady doesn't have to mean closed off. Claire's expression softened, just slightly. That's a hard shift, she said. Yeah, he admitted. It is. Neither of them moved. The space between them felt different now, not uncertain, but aware in a way that didn't need to be explained. "Those letters," George said suddenly. "The ones you mentioned." Claire tilted her head. "What about them? They didn't fix anything, did they?" "No," she said. "They tried to." He nodded slowly. "I don't think I want to leave things like that," he said. Claire held his gaze, something steady in her expression now. "Then don't," she said. Simple, direct, not easy but clear. George exhaled slowly, something shifting into place. "All right," he said. The word carried more weight than it sounded like it should. Claire seemed to understand anyway. "All right," she echoed. And for the first time since the cellar floor had cracked open, George felt like he understood what had actually been unearthed. Not a crime, not a danger, a decision. And this time he wasn't going to bury it. Chapter 8, a different kind of foundation. George didn't rush back to the cellar after that conversation. For the first time since the floor had cracked open and revealed something hidden beneath, he didn't feel the pull to fix it immediately, to restore it, cover it, make it neat and predictable again. Instead, he stayed upstairs. The house felt quieter than it had in weeks, but not hollow, not unfinished, just waiting. He stood at the kitchen counter, staring out the window toward the barn, turning Claire's words over in his head. Simple doesn't have to mean alone. He exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he muttered. "I know. But knowing something and acting on it weren't always the same thing." His phone buzzed, pulling him out of the thought. A message this time. "Shelley, movie night this weekend? We promised our friends. Bella. Also, we are inviting Claire. Just so you know." George stared at the screen, then let out a quiet huff of laughter. "Of course you are," he said. He typed back. "We'll talk about it when you get here." The reply came instantly. "Shelley, that means yes." "Bella, Dad said yes." George shook his head, setting the phone down. "They are absolutely going to run my life," he said, though there was no frustration behind it, just acceptance. By Friday evening, the barn was alive again. The echo of chatter filled the open space, layered with laughter and the occasional argument about which movie deserved to be watched first. Extra chairs had been pulled out. The popcorn machine worked overtime. Someone had turned the music up too loud until Shelley corrected it with authority that made George raise an eyebrow. "You've been practicing that tone," he said as he passed her. "It's effective," she replied without hesitation. "You sound like your mother," he said before he could stop himself. Shelley paused, then smirked slightly. "I'll choose to take that as a compliment." George blinked. "That's new." "I'm evolving," she said. Bella bounded past them, nearly colliding into George as she carried an armful of blankets. "Careful," he said. "No time," she replied. "People are cold." "It's not cold. It's movie night. That means blankets." "That's not a rule." "It is in this barn." George held up his hands in surrender. "All right, fair enough." He stepped back toward the makeshift bar, grabbing a water and scanning the room. Familiar faces, new ones, parents he recognized. A few he didn't yet but would meet before the night was over. And in the middle of it, Claire. She stood near the projector area, talking easily with one of the other parents, her posture relaxed, her expression lighter than he'd seen it when she was working. She glanced up, caught his eye, and gave a small, knowing smile before turning back to the conversation. George felt something settle into place. Not a jolt, not a surprise, just right. "She came," Bella said, appearing beside him. "I noticed," George replied. Shelley joined them, arms crossed in satisfaction. "We told you she would. You invited her without asking me," he pointed out. "We knew you'd say yes," Bella said. "That's not the point." "It is if we're right," Shelley countered. George exhaled, fighting a losing battle and not particularly invested in winning it. "You two are," he started. "Correct," Shelley finished. Bella grinned. "Always." "Rarely," George corrected. "Frequently," Shelley amended. "All right," he said, giving up. "Go pick a movie." "We already did," Bella replied. "Of course you did." They disappeared back into the group, leaving George standing there with the lingering sense that his life had quietly shifted a few degrees in a direction he hadn't planned. But hadn't resisted either. A moment later, Claire made her way over. "It's busier tonight," she said, glancing around. "Word spread," George replied. "Apparently I run a very popular establishment now." "I can see why." He handed her a drink without asking. "You're getting predictable," she said, taking it. "Efficient," he corrected. "Sure." They stood side by side, watching the room settle into the familiar chaos of people finding seats, negotiating space, settling into comfort. "This is what you built," she said quietly. George looked at her. "It's what we use." "That's not the same thing," she replied. He let that sit for a moment. "No," he admitted. "It's not." Claire leaned lightly against the edge of the bar, her gaze moving from the girls to the screen to the small clusters of people talking and laughing. "You ever think about changing anything?" she asked. George considered it. "A few things," he said. "Like what?" He glanced at her, then back at the room. Expanding, he said. Making space for more. Claire's expression shifted, just slightly. More people? She asked. Maybe, he replied. Or something else? He met her gaze fully this time. Depends what shows up, he said. There it was again. Clear. Not rushed. Not forced. Just honest. Claire held his gaze for a second, then nodded. That sounds like a good plan, she said. The room dimmed as someone shut off the main lights, and the projector flickered to life. The first images spilled across the back wall, drawing everyone's attention. Bella's voice cut through the soft hum. Dad, sit down, you're blocking. George shook his head, stepping aside. Always appreciated, he said under his breath. Claire laughed softly. Come on, she said, nodding toward a pair of chairs slightly off to the side. Before they assign us seats. That sounds like something they'd do, he replied. They sat, not directly next to each other, but close enough that the space felt intentional. Comfortable. The movie started, the noise settling into quieter reactions. Laughter, the occasional comment, shared moments that didn't need to be spoken out loud. Halfway through, George leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting from the screen to everything around it. The girls laughing with their friends. The familiar rhythm of something that had grown over time. The barn that had started as a project and become something more. And beside him, Claire. Not a disruption. Not chaos. Not something to avoid. Something steady in a different way. He exhaled quietly, almost without realizing it. Everything all right? She asked, her voice low. He nodded, eyes still on the screen. Yeah, he said. A small pause. Then, quietly, better than all right. Claire didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. When he glanced over, she was already looking at him, her expression easy, certain. And for the first time in a long while, George Hall wasn't thinking about what might go wrong. He was thinking about what he could build next. Not instead of what he had, but alongside it. A different kind of foundation. One he didn't feel the need to bury. One he was ready, finally, to let grow.